The man stood frozen, his throat dry, his chest heavy, as dozens of eyes locked on him with cold amusement. He had walked into the hall hoping for fairness, hoping someone would listen, but instead he was standing in the middle of a storm he could not stop. His voice had cracked earlier when he tried to explain, but now it was gone, drowned by the sound of laughter that rose like cruel waves crashing against him. His so-called friends stood in the back, smirking, their arms crossed as if his pain were nothing more than a show for their entertainment. His co-workers leaned forward in their chairs, whispering and chuckling, some covering their mouths to hide their grins, others laughing openly. Even his neighbors, people he had helped over the years, were there, their faces lit with twisted joy. He looked at them one by one, searching for even a spark of compassion, but found none. Every face reminded him that he was alone. The accusations against him had been read aloud minutes earlier, each word tearing at his dignity. False claims, twisted half-truths, carefully planted lies designed to crush him. He tried to defend himself, tried to explain, but every time he opened his mouth someone interrupted with another mocking comment. "Sure you didn't do it," one man had sneered, "just like you didn't fail at your job, right?" Another woman laughed and shouted, "Tell us another story. Maybe you'll convince yourself next time." The sound of their laughter still rang in his ears now, louder than his heartbeat, sharper than any blade. His body trembled, but he forced himself to stay upright. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall, not yet. In that moment, he realized the cruel truth. People loved a downfall more than a success. When he had been doing well, when his job was steady and his home filled with warmth, many of these same faces had smiled at him, asked him for favors, enjoyed his generosity. But now that he was broken, now that he was accused, they wanted nothing more than to tear him apart. Misery was their entertainment, and he was their stage. He thought of his family, of his children who had asked him that morning why he looked so worried. He thought of his wife, her soft words telling him to be strong, even when he saw the doubt in her eyes. They weren't here tonight, thank God, but he felt their absence like a wound. If they could see this humiliation, it would crush them. The officials in charge said nothing to stop the laughter. They let it happen, maybe even enjoyed it. One of them leaned toward another and whispered something that made both men chuckle. The man saw it, and the fire inside him grew hotter. His fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms until he nearly drew blood. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to shout the truth until the walls shook, but what good would it do? They didn't want the truth. They wanted his ruin. They had already chosen the story they would believe. His legs felt weak, his knees shaking under the weight of the moment, but he refused to bow. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and stared into the crowd. The laughter quieted just slightly as some realized he was no longer looking away. He let the silence hang for a moment, his eyes sweeping across them, memorizing their faces, burning them into his mind. Every smirk, every sneer, every laugh. They became names in an invisible list etched into his soul. He thought to himself, "You laugh today, but one day this laughter will die in your throats." Someone shouted, "What are you staring at?" And the laughter started again, louder this time, mocking, cruel. But the man didn't flinch. He stood still, absorbing every sound, letting it carve into him, letting it transform into fuel. He would not forget this night. He would not forget how they stripped him of dignity and turned him into a joke. They thought this was the end of him. They thought his silence meant defeat. But deep inside, under the shame, something stronger began to rise. As the laughter echoed on, he closed his eyes for a moment. He saw the future not as they saw it, but as he would create it. They believed they had destroyed him, but they had only planted the seed of something they could never control. He whispered under his breath, too softly for them to hear, "Laugh while you can." The man spent the next nights in silence, lying awake on the hard bed of his small rented room, the sound of laughter from that night still echoing in his ears like a curse. Every time he closed his eyes he saw their faces, the twisted smiles of neighbors, the smirks of co-workers, the fake friends who once ate at his table but now cheered at his humiliation. At first the silence felt heavy, crushing him under the weight of shame, But as the nights dragged on, something began to change. The shame didn't break him, it hardened him. Each laugh, each insult, each whisper turned into fuel. He began to replay the events over and over in his head, not with sorrow but with calculation. He remembered the words spoken, the expressions on faces, the order of every insult. Slowly, he opened a notebook, plain and black, and began to write. The first page carried a single word, debts. Underneath it he wrote names, one by one, his handwriting steady and sharp. Every neighbor who laughed, every friend who betrayed him, every coworker who framed him, and above them all, the ones who had started it, Karen and her board of followers. When he finished the page, he closed the notebook and stared at it for a long time. It was no longer just paper and ink. It was a map, a promise, a future. By day he lived quietly, almost invisible, walking through the streets like a ghost nobody wanted to see. People ignored him now, which suited him. He listened when no one paid attention, blending into the background, gathering whispers and rumors. By night, he studied. He borrowed old laptops, spent hours in libraries, and learned about technology, security, and how information could be used as a weapon sharper than any knife. He read about psychology, about how people broke when their secrets were revealed, how power crumbled when the truth was dragged into the light. Slowly he rebuilt himself, not as the man they once knew, but as something new, something dangerous. The same way they had watched him fall, he would watch them, and he would strike when they least expected. He became disciplined. His mornings began with exercise, long runs where he let his mind sharpen while his body grew stronger. His afternoons were spent in quiet study, digging deeper into every name in his notebook, tracing their connections, learning their weaknesses. At night he wrote notes, arrows, and plans until his notebook filled with paths of revenge, each line leading to a strike that would one day land. He didn't act yet. Patience was his ally. He knew the power of waiting, of watching. He remembered their laughter and let it echo in his head not as pain but as motivation. Each chuckle, each insult reminded him why he could not fail. Neighbors still passed him on the street, some laughing quietly, some sneering openly, thinking he had disappeared into failure. But behind his calm eyes, he was building something they could not see. Once, they had called him weak, broken, finished. But now, every breath he took was a step closer to the moment they would realize the truth. He wasn't finished. He was preparing. And when the time came, when the strikes began, their laughter would turn to silence, and their smiles would vanish forever. The man moved like a shadow through his days, unseen and patient, and his work in the quiet hours began to take shape into something dangerous and precise. He learned to be careful with his steps and careful with his words, never speaking of his plans aloud, instead writing each small move in the black notebook that had become his map to justice. He read everything he could find about people, about systems, about how a secret can topple a proud man faster than any shoving can, and he used public records, old receipts, court filings, and 1,000 tiny details people left behind because they believed no one would look. Each detail became a thread and he learned to pull those threads at the right moment. He discovered that the neighbor who laughed the loudest had a quiet life full of secrets, unpaid taxes hidden under shell companies and late notices that were carefully buried inside a folder no one opened. He found that a woman who mocked him had a list of flirtations that could ruin a marriage, and that a coworker who had planted lies against him had skimmed small amounts from project budgets for years, passing the money through vendors who were nothing but names on paper. He gathered what he could without touching their doors or confronting their faces. He sent carefully worded questions to public offices. He filed anonymous tips where the law would follow the paper trail. He saved copies of everything in digital files that he kept safe on a drive that never left his side. He taught himself the language of investigation by watching tutorials, reading legal guides, and practicing his notes until his handwriting became a map of intent. He learned how to build anonymous email accounts, how to use public databases, how to request records under the right forms so no one would suspect the requests came from him, and slowly the pattern he wanted to reveal grew stronger and undeniable. He also trained himself in small ways that polished his methods. He learned how to check a financial record for small discrepancies, how to spot a doctored invoice, how to follow a trail of payments from a business to the bank account of a relative. and he learned how to package those facts into plain language that would sting the most when read aloud. All the while he kept his body steady with long walks and simple routines so his face never betrayed the storm that built inside. When people saw him passing by they still thought him broken and quiet, not the careful strategist he had become. He did not limit himself to paper. He watched behavior, the way people answered their phones, who met whom at quiet cafes, which cars arrived late at night and which left before dawn, and he took mental notes, matching habits to the records he held. He found that the same people who laughed at him had formed a small network of favors and silences that had protected the lies they told. And to break that network he needed more than facts. He needed timing. He needed to hit where their pride lived. And where their secrets would hurt most. He planned the first real strikes to unfold like a sequence of small shocks that would not look like a single hand at work so the pattern would not be obvious until it was too late. He decided to start with the easiest target. The man who had gossiped the loudest at the meeting and who had a business dependent on public trust. He prepared a file of documented misdeeds, gathered the emails that matched his hidden accounting, and arranged to send the proof to the right regulator and to a reporter who knew how to write without sentimental mercy. He watched from a distance as the first stories broke and felt a cold satisfaction when that man's name moved from smug to scandalous. But he never celebrated for long because he knew one collapse would only feed their caution and make the rest harder. So he layered his attacks, setting small traps that exposed more than one wrongdoing in a week. Each leak carefully nudged into public view. An anonymous envelope to a city office, a scanned invoice sent to a journalist, a tip to a contractor who resented being cheated. Little things that looked like random complaints but that together formed a pattern of misuse and greed. While the neighborhood panicked and whispered, he sat with his notebook and drew lines between events, checking off names as consequences followed. He kept his son close in a new way, teaching him small lessons in observation and patience, asking him to notice who arrived at what hour and who always locked their gates at night. The boy learned to be quiet and helpful, bringing files to the man or running small checks online, and his involvement was careful and only ever indirect so no link could easily be found back to the father. When the father walked into a coffee shop he watched faces more than cups. He memorized mannerisms and kept a slow list of habits that would later prove to be keys to motives and opportunities. He practiced telling the story he would one day present until every phrase fit like a lock turned by his chosen key. His language became plain and sharp because he knew drama would not win hearts but truth would, and truth, when packaged simply, breaks the proud. As he prepared, he learned another lesson. Mistakes come from haste and pride, so he let the others accelerate in their arrogance. Watching Karen hand out her fines and scoff at the poor, seeing other neighbors pile on with sneers, believing their safety was absolute because no one confronted them. Their laughter fed their carelessness. That laughter was a sound he would never forget, and it became the drumbeat to his plan. He timed his moves so they landed after key events, after bonus payments, or just before a neighbor was due to receive recognition, striking where humiliation would be strongest and where the fall would be most public. He also kept an eye on legality and fairness, because his goal was not to become what they were. He wanted to unmask them cleanly, to let the law and public fact do the work, and this moral backbone steadied him when small doubts crept in at night, reminding him that he sought justice not cruelty, that the man who had been laughed at deserved to be heard and those who used laughter as a weapon needed to be shown to the world for what they were. In the quiet hours he mapped out the final reveal. A public meeting, a place they trusted, where faces and voices could not hide behind screens. Where proof could be shown and questions could be asked. He imagined their mouths falling open, their smiles dissolving. But until that day he kept moving in small careful ways, never showing his hand, never letting anger push him into error. His life had been torn down and he had rebuilt it in the dark into a patient machine of truth. And as the days passed and his list shortened in his mind, he felt the cold satisfaction of a craftsman nearing the work's last strokes. He was no longer the broken man the world had seen. He was the quiet architect of a reckoning they would never see coming. The man watched from a distance as the small cracks he had started to make widened into fractures that ran through the neat faces of the neighborhood. He did not rush. He let things fall into place, and when they did the sound of their pride breaking was loud enough to be heard from the street. He began with the easiest targets, not the loudest nor the richest, but those whose small conveniences depended on secrets they thought safe. The first neighbor to fall was the loud one who had jeered at him in the hall. His business relied on local trust, and the man had found a paper trail showing invoices that never matched the work done. He sent that trail to the agency that enforced licenses. And within a week inspectors arrived with clipboards and stern faces. Customers cancelled orders. And rumors turned to headlines that followed the man to his driveway where a tow truck took a van that had once been the pride of his street. People watched as a man who had laughed the loudest watched his own life dismantle on the curb, and the sound of shifting eyes became the new music of the neighborhood. The man felt no joy in the sight, only the calm acceptance of someone who had set things right. Next came the couple who had come to meetings with perfect smiles while whispering cruel advice behind his back. They had a tidy little secret, a side investment that masked unpaid loans and late payments, and he quietly fed the correct files to a creditor who had been used and ignored. By the time the letters arrived and the legal notices followed, their garden parties were empty and their invitations unreturned. Each fall was surgical, precise, and public enough to hurt pride but not cruel enough to be called lawless. He always left a path for truth to do the work. He submitted records, he gave journalists factual leads, he used public forms and legal channels so when the neighbors cried foul they had to point to the same facts he had delivered. People began to whisper in new tones, not the easy laughter of before but a nervous chatter that asked who was next. The man walked among them like a ghost, his face calm, his notebook closed in his pocket, and when someone caught his eye they could not tell what he felt because his expression never cracked. While those small fires burned, he kept watching Karen most of all. She had lost her allies quickly as the men and women she depended on saw themselves fall, and something that had looked like confidence before now looked patched and thin. Karen doubled down at first. She held meetings, she wrote stern letters, she tried to rally the remaining supporters with loud speeches about order and rule. But the man had already placed quiet, unanswerable facts where her words could not reach. He had copies of receipts showing money labeled maintenance that bought personal dinners, gas cards, and odd purchases that had nothing to do with pools or landscaping, and those copies found their way into the right hands, hands that preferred evidence to protests. At the community center one night her supporters tried to shout him down, to call him a liar and a troublemaker, but neighbors who had seen letters and invoices in their mail now stood and asked exact questions. Where is the report for last spring's repair? Who signed off on the contractor's invoice for $10,000 that left no record of work done? The man let those questions land and he let silence do the rest. Karen had to answer, she had to explain, and in every answer the house of cards she had built moved closer to collapse. He was careful with each exposure because he had learned that people who feel attacked will strike back with their own versions of truth. So he always kept clean hands, he never doctored documents, he never threatened anyone directly, and he never allowed his work to be dismissed as petty revenge. Instead he used the exact paperwork that showed the discrepancies. The audited lines that revealed how money flowed out of community accounts and into accounts tied to people who had once smiled at him. The effect was not only financial. Pride bruises the loudest, and watching the same faces that had mocked him swallow apologies or hasty explanations was its own kind of justice. Men who had once called him a fool now hesitated at the mailman's walk. Women who had rolled their eyes at his requests for help now mumbled when asked to sign a petition. And children who had tugged at their parents to point at his empty driveway stopped asking. As those small collapses happened, he turned his attention to social power, the rumor mills and the alliances that kept people safe. He released carefully worded tips to people who kept the neighborhood's history. Old volunteers, longtime officials, even a retired reporter who still loved a good truth. And those tips grew into stories that made polite conversation at Sunday barbecues impossible. People looked at each other with new doubt. Trust eroded in inches until it was hard to stand on. He watched Karen shrink in public even as she tried to project fury, her clipboard no longer a symbol of absolute power but a prop she clutched because she had nothing else, and that fright made her reckless. She started ordering fines more loudly, waving penalties at people in the street, but the man had already prepared for that too. He had copies of the fine notices she issued and the bank records showing where the money went, and when neighbors compared notes they realized the fines funneled money into places that did not serve the community at all. The result was quiet but devastating. Her credibility bled away as slowly and surely as a wound. Petitions for her removal circulated. Board members who had taken her side found themselves asked for explanations they could not give, and the man watched the structure of her power begin to wobble. He never gnashed his teeth or bragged. His satisfaction was private and small, a steady warmth that replaced the cold of his old fear. He also made sure to shield those who had been honest with him, people who had once offered a kind word when he was fired, neighbors who quietly fed him leads or shook their heads at Karen's cruelty. He used his evidence selectively so collateral damage would be minimal, He wanted justice, not a run of cruelty that would only create new victims. As the street shifted, some tried to make sense of the sudden turn of fortunes. Rumors flew, of course, and many guessed at anonymous enemies. But the man kept his voice silent in public and let the facts speak for themselves. And that silence was as sharp as any accusation. Plans for a final public reveal began to form in his mind, but he did not rush them. He tested reactions with small leaks, measured how people responded when secrets came to light, refined his timing until he knew the exact moment when the truth would have the most force. By the time he was ready to move toward his big reveal, Karen had lost her strongest supporters. Several families no longer sat with her at dinners, and her name had become something people muttered as a warning to their children. The man closed his notebook one evening watching the bright windows of the houses he once called home, and he felt a quiet readiness settle over him. They had laughed at his pain, they had mocked his fall, but their smiles were gone now, the ground had shifted beneath them, and he stood on steady ground he had built stone by careful stone, his hand on the next page of his plan ready to write the name that would bring everything into the clear light of day. The night of the gathering arrived like a stage set for destiny, the community hall filled with rows of folding chairs and buzzing voices, everyone expecting another evening of Karen's speeches and endless rules. But this time something different hung in the air, a tension no one could name but everyone could feel. The man entered quietly, his steps slow, his head held steady, carrying nothing but his black notebook tucked inside his jacket. And his presence drew whispers as he walked past those who had once laughed at him, their eyes darting with unease. Karen sat at the front with her clipboard, her smug smile pasted on her face though her hands gripped the pen too tightly, her eyes sharp with suspicion as she saw him take a seat near the front. She slammed the gavel and began as she always did, her voice loud and commanding. "Tonight we will address rule violations and unpaid fines," she declared, her tone dripping with superiority. But before she could continue, the man rose to his feet. The room grew quiet, all eyes turning toward him, because for years he had remained silent, never speaking at these meetings after his downfall. But now his voice broke the air, calm but steady. "Tonight," he said, "we speak not of rules but of truth." Karen scoffed, waving her clipboard like a shield. "You have no authority here. Sit down before I have you removed." But her voice trembled at the edges, betraying her fear. The man stepped closer to the center, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "You all laughed when I fell. You believed the lies, you joined in the mockery. But while you laughed, I listened, I learned, and I gathered what you thought would stay hidden. Tonight those secrets come into the light." He opened his notebook slowly, the sound of the paper crisp in the silence, and began reading names. With each name came a truth, undeniable and sharp. He spoke of the neighbor who had stolen funds through fake invoices, producing copies of the records he had delivered to authorities. The man sank into his chair, pale, as whispers spread around him. He spoke of the woman who mocked his pain yet betrayed her family in secret, her face turning red as murmurs rose from every corner of the hall. One by one, the names became stories, and the stories became proof, facts too strong to deny. Karen slammed her gavel again, shouting, "Lies! All lies! He fabricates everything because he is bitter." But her voice was drowned out by the crowd, who had begun to stand, demanding answers from those whose secrets had just been revealed. The man let the storm build before delivering the final blow. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small drive, handing it to the projector operator. The screen lit up, showing receipts, bank records, and finally a video. Karen herself, caught late at night near his home. Her hands on wires she had no business touching, her face frozen in the glare of a porch light. Gasps filled the room, then shouts, then outrage. Karen tried to stand, tried to speak, but her voice cracked as she stammered, I was only checking the lines." No one believed her. Neighbors shouted over her, demanding her resignation, some calling for police, others jeering at the woman who had once made them all afraid. The man stood still, silent, his eyes locked on Karen, letting the voices of the crowd become the judgment she could not escape. For the first time in years, she was the one humiliated, stripped of dignity, her power crumbling before the same people she once controlled. The man closed his notebook slowly and whispered, though everyone could hear him in the hush that followed, You laughed at my pain, but tonight your laughter is gone. The hall erupted again, this time not in mockery but in support, voices rising to condemn the guilty and cheer the man who had stood tall. He walked out calmly, leaving the storm behind him, his revenge nearly complete. The hall behind him still shook with shouts and accusations as the man stepped into the cool night. But he didn't need to hear any more. He had seen their faces, seen the way their arrogance melted into fear, and that was enough. The revenge that had lived in his chest for so long was no longer a dream. It was real, it was finished. He walked slowly down the path, his notebook heavy in his pocket, though not from the paper inside but from the weight of every memory, every laugh that had once torn at him. His son joined him, eyes wide with pride, and asked, "Is it really over?" The man paused under the streetlight, his shadow stretching long across the pavement, and nodded. "It's over for them, but for us it's a beginning." The next days confirmed it. Karen resigned from the HOA under pressure, her name whispered with disgust instead of fear. The neighbors who had mocked him now avoided his eyes, their voices low, their pride shattered. Some tried to apologize, stammering excuses about being misled, about not knowing the truth, but he only gave them a cold look, because he remembered every smirk, every whisper, every moment they had chosen laughter over compassion. They had enjoyed his humiliation, now they would live with theirs. The news spread beyond the neighborhood too, whispers traveling into offices, schools, and gatherings, the story of how the proud had fallen, how secrets had been dragged into daylight, how a man once broken had turned silent patience into a weapon sharper than steel. Those who heard it shook their heads in disbelief, but those who lived it could never forget. The man sat alone one evening in his small room, the same room where he had once felt crushed and hopeless, and opened his notebook. The pages that had once been filled with names and debts were now almost empty, line after line crossed out with steady strokes, promises fulfilled. Only one page remained untouched, the first, where he had written the word debts. He looked at it for a long time, then closed the book and slid it into the drawer. He no longer needed it. He had paid back every laugh, every betrayal, every humiliation. They had taken his dignity, but he had taken their power, their comfort, their pride, and in that exchange he had won more than they could ever understand. Outside, the neighborhood was quieter than he remembered, the loud voices gone, the false laughter silenced. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't the broken man they once mocked. He wasn't even the same man who had first picked up that notebook. He had become something else, patient, sharp, unshakable. His revenge was complete, but more than that, his strength was restored. As he turned off the light and let the night settle around him, he whispered into the silence, "They laughed at my pain, but in the end, I laughed last." And with that, he closed his eyes, no longer haunted by echoes of ridicule, but steadied by the silence he had earned, a silence where his enemies could never speak over him again.